this country is at war with Germany.
We shall go on to the end.
I remember the sheets of flame which came up and almost blinded us from our guns.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the World War II podcast. I'm Angus Wallace. In late 1944, as a precursor to the invasion of the Philippines, US military analysts decided to seize the small island of Peleliu to ensure the Japanese airfield there could not threaten the invasion forces. It was estimated that the island would fall in a week or so. In fact, the fighting on Peleliu would go on for 74 days. The US would pay a heavy price for capturing the island, with a higher casualty rate than both the fighting on Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Today, I'm joined by Pacific War historian Joseph Wheelan and author of Bitter Peleliu, The Forgotten Struggle on the Pacific War's Worst Battlefield. Joseph, thanks for joining me. Let's start by placing Peleliu geographically. Where is it in the Pacific?
It's part of the Palau Islands, and that chain is 500 miles directly east of the Philippines. Let's see, 7 degrees north of the equator. So it's out there in the western Pacific, part of the Caroline Island. It's pretty obscure. Peleliu is just one of the Palau Islands, but there was an airstrip there, and that was the key.
What surprised me is it is actually a Japanese island before the war, and I wondered, was it a military presence pre-Second War? Because in my mind, I just assumed the Japanese had taken it when they launched their offensive at the end of 41.
They had it earlier, and they built the airstrip, I think, starting 1939, 40. And it wasn't one of their 37 islands or anything like that, but it was part of their plan to extend their reach into the Southwest Pacific. So they built this airstrip, and they had 100, 200 planes based there. But the U.S. carrier fleet hit it in March 1944 and basically wiped out all the planes, pitted the runways, and then they came back in July and August and hit it again. So it was, by the time our people landed in September of 44, it was inoperable. But the whole idea was to knock it out of circulation because there's this fear that the Japanese would launch air offensive against MacArthur's troops, which were scheduled to land in the Philippines in Mindanao later in the year. But all that changed, too. And Admiral Halsey actually tried to cancel the Peleliu campaign because it didn't need to be fought. MacArthur was going to land at Leyte and not Mindanao. It's quite a ways farther north, but it was too late at that point. Admiral Nimitz said, "No, we need to go ahead with it. The ships are at sea," and so they landed. If you had to sum it up, you'd have to say it was a battle that needn't have been fought at all to neutralize an airfield that had already been neutralized.
I wondered, considering the airfield has been neutralised and the garrison would seem to be relatively isolated, did the Japanese expect to be attacked, or did they assume they might be just bypassed?
No, they expected to be attacked. They had good intelligence. They knew when the U.S. was going to land troops there, that it would be September, mid-September. And so they were ready for it. And they had been sent all this construction material in the spring, late spring, to prepare their defenses because the Imperial headquarters had miscalculated, and they thought Peleliu was going to be hit next, Palau Islands. But actually, it wasn't the Palau Islands. It was Saipan, Guam, and Tinian, the Marianas. And so the construction material sent to Peleliu, not the Marianas. And then they tried to correct the mistake, and they sent the material there too late. It was still stacked up when American troops invaded the Marianas. But Peleliu was prepared. They had all the material they needed to build bunkers, and it was basically an underground defensive network that they built in these coral limestone rock formations underneath. They had 500 caves. They had tunnels everywhere. They brought in miners from Japan to build the tunnels. They had a naval construction battalion that dug bunkers. And all of the positions covered one another. So you attack one, you catch fire from two other sources. And you really can't even see where it's coming from because they were all underground. It's an underground defense.
So, I mean, these landings are usually accompanied by, the American US Navy can put an enormous amount of firepower down in offshore fire support. Does Peleliu get a preliminary bombardment? How effective was it? Because presumably they can fly as they wish over the island to select targets.
Well, that was another problem, the reconnaissance of the island. So they had a submarine taking photographs off the coast. They had aerial reconnaissance, took photographs from above. But from above, the island looked like one green mass, like one huge ridge covered by all this jungle, undergrowth, trees. So you really couldn't see what was under there. So they bombarded it. And that was another problem. The Navy said they could only devote 2 days to the bombardment. The Marines asked for 11 days. The Navy said they didn't have the shells to do it because they had expended so many shells on the Marianas campaign just a few months before. Guam, for example, got 14 days bombardment, but all they could do was 2 days for Peleliu. So there was quite an argument over that. And the Admiral Oldendorf, who was in charge of the bombardment, said, okay, I can expand it to 3 days, but I cannot increase the number of shells used. So that's what they did.
To add to the difficulties of Peleliu, so there's low-lying coral shoals around the island, so this prevents the landing craft, the Higgin boats, landing. So how did you get Marines to shore if the landing craft can't get to shore?
It was very tricky. It was a 500-yard wide coral reef ringed the island. You'd cross the coral reef, and then there was 700-yard lagoon to the beach. They had encountered this first time on Tarawa, 1943, and it had been disastrous. Coral reef, they were trying to use Higgins boats, which are flat-bottomed boats, across the reef, and they had miscalculated the tide, and they had tried to cross it on a neap tide. They couldn't do it, so they had to let the Marines off, and some of them went ashore in rubber boats. They just got shot up. They manufactured more landing craft, called them LVTs, landing vehicle tanks, because they had treads on the bottom, and you needed tracked vehicles to get over the reefs. So they had those for Peleliu, but they didn't have enough because they had all these other campaigns going. There were more LVTs out there, but more campaigns. So what they did, and they practiced this before the landing at a place where there was no reef, ironically, it was off Guadalcanal. Since they didn't have enough LVTs, they would, the first waves of LVTs would cross the reef and take the amphibious troops ashore. And then they would come back to the reef, and the Higgins boats would bring the subsequent waves, and they would transfer from the Higgins boats to the LVTs, go ashore, bring wounded back to the reef, transfer them to the Higgins boats, and they would go back to the ships. So it was a kind of a complicated deal. The Japanese knew there would be problems at the reef, so they pre-registered their mortars and artillery from the island on the reef. And so it was a mess on the reef and on the beach.
I can't imagine how difficult it must be, fully equipped, trying to get all your kit off a Higgins. Well, for one thing, you've gone down a scramble net onto a Higgins boat. Then you've gone from a Higgins boat to clamber onto an LVT. I mean, it must be slow and perilous without being under fire.
I'm sure. And I'm sure they lost some of those people too, in the water. They were encumbered with all that gear. But yeah, once they got transferred there, though, all of a sudden they were under fire. Well, they lost a lot of those LVTs, in the landing. 26 of them were destroyed.
I'm right in saying that previously the Japanese had sometimes left landings had been uncontested, but this time the Japanese have a new tactic of, and I forgot what it was called, fukaku? Is that what it was? Have I got that right?
That's right, fukaku. Right.
Defense in depth.
Meant that they would base most of their defenses underground and wait for the invaders to come to them and fight a battle of attrition, kill as many of them as possible. And all this goes back to the Mariana Island campaigns, where the Japanese lost those 3 islands, Guam, Tinian, and Saipan, and then lost most of their Air Force, what they call the Mariana Turkey Shoot. They were shot down. At that point, many of the senior commanders, not all of them, realized the war was lost, and that the best they could hope for was a negotiated peace, because they were going to lose the war. They could see it. At the beginning of the war, Admiral Yamamoto was the one who said, if we don't win this war in the first year, we need to sue for peace, because the United States will beat us. He had spent time in the United States and saw the industrial capacity the U.S. possessed. That's where they were at this point. So they changed their strategy on the islands to one of attrition. Instead of launching these gigantic banzai attacks to try to stop the invaders at the water's edge, they would oppose the landings. They would use artillery mortars and maybe some emplacements, not right on the beach, but inland a little bit. But then after that, wait for them to come in. Peleliu had this central ridge that looked just like it was all green from the air when they did the recon on it. But actually, as the naval gunfire and airstrikes defoliated it, they saw that it was just this horrible landscape. It was coral limestone terrain. You had these knife-edge ridges and cliffs and gulches and box canyons. And like I said, there were 500 caves. The Japanese were just waited for them in there to come in. They calculated where they would land. They knew they were going to land on the beaches they landed on because that was the best place to land. And they knew where they would attack. So it was kind of a bad situation for the Americans.
Well, presumably they'd second-guessed that the first major objective would be the airfield. They're flying from, I remember I got this right, they're flying from the airfield before they've even secured it. So they're flying on day 3, have they got that right?
They secured it, I think, the second day. And then the construction troops moved in and they started repairing it. And I think 5 or 6 days after the landing, they were able to land reconnaissance planes. And then pretty soon after that, the Corsairs came in and they would bomb the ridges and rocket them. And it's like a 15-second flight to the ridge,
It's remarkable. Now, when we're looking at the airfield, well, one thing that sort of is worth a mention, the Japanese do actually, when the Americans are trying to take it, they counterattack across with tanks. Now, we never hear, or rarely hear, tanks, Japanese tanks. Was this a surprise to the Marines? Are they equipped to repel an armoured assault?
And it was mistimed. They deduced later on Japanese probably meant to launch that attack as the Marines were landing, first landings. But they waited until the afternoon. So there were a lot of Marines ashore. There were like 4 battalions near the airfield. And the Japanese had these, they called them tankettes, really small tanks, and lightly armored. And all of a sudden, across the airfield, they came tearing. There were like 12 of them, with infantry clinging to the tanks and in their trace as well. the Marines were kind of amazed, but they had artillery, they had mortars, they had machine guns, and their tanks, big tanks, and they just destroyed every one of those tank ads. It was a disaster for the Japanese. I think they destroyed 13 tanks. The attack had hardly any effect on the troops that were ashore. And then the next day, the Marines actually crossed the airfield and secured it.
Well, once they've secured the airfield, the fighting moves to that ridge, which is the is that Umbrolio Pocket?
I think it's called the Umbrogel.
It's Chesty Puller and his first Marines who were initially assigned to wiping out the pocket. Now, Chesty Puller must be. He's probably the most famous Marine ever to have lived now. I mean, was he that well known at the time, Chesty Puller?
Yeah, I think he was. He had been in the Marines since right after World War I, fought in the Banana Wars, fought in Haiti and Nicaragua, was highly decorated there and won Navy crosses. And then World War II, he was on Guadalcanal. That was the first great land battle of World War II for the Americans. That battle was touch and go because the Japanese Navy was still pretty powerful, and they controlled the seas around Guadalcanal. But Puller commanded, at that time, the 7th Regiment of the Marines, and they played a key role. He was wounded there, and on Peleliu, his wound was really bothering him. He had a big piece of shrapnel in his leg still. He had to be carried around at times on a stretcher to talk to his commanders. He was a real character, though. Yeah, he established his command post farther toward the front line than anyone else. I mean, it was right up there. And all he had was like a piece of tin over to stay out of the sun, and then he had his maps. His regiment was destroyed, basically, in these attacks that they made on the Umbrogel. They attacked the same way every day. But it really wasn't his fault. I don't blame him. It was his commander, the general who's in charge of the 1st Marine Division, William Rupertus, made a couple of errors. First error was that he totally underestimated the time it would take to capture this island. He told the news people that it'd be 4 days. So it'll be rough but fast. And so the Marines were very encouraged when they heard that. But he was off by 70 days. It took 74 days. And totally unimaginative offensives. Every day they would attack head-on into those rock formations from the south to the north. 8:30 every morning, resume the attack. They destroyed a lot of Japanese defenses and killed a lot of Japanese, but the toll that it took on Puller's regiment was terrible.
He's offered support from the U.S. Army. Geiger suggests he used. He's absolutely adamant he wasn't going to use them. Why is he not using reserves from the Army?
There's a problem between the two services that developed. There always was. It was exasperated at the Battle of Saipan, like 3 or 4 months earlier, where you had a mixture of Marine troops, Marine units, and the Army's 27th Division. The Marine commander who's in charge of the whole operation thought the Army was moving too slowly. So the Marines' flanks were being exposed. Became quite exasperated over this, and he fired the Army general, dismissed him. This really exasperated the rivalry between the two services, to say the least. And so Rupertus, who subscribed to the belief that the Army was inferior to the Marines, didn't want to use the Army at all on Peleliu. They were sent to this other island, which was 6 miles south of Peleliu, called Angar. 81st Infantry Division was sent there. Paul Mueller was the general. They were sent there against a much smaller garrison. There were like 1,400 troops. under the Japanese major on that little island. And so they eventually conquered it. They had more than enough people to do that. But finally, Rupertus was forced by the commander, the whole Operation Stalemate, to bring in one of the regiments from the Army, the 321st Regimental Combat Team, over Rupertus's objections, over Polar's objections. And then the 1st Marines under Polar, they were relieved, and they were pulled off of Peleliu. They had been shot up so badly. I mean, on the first day, they lost 500 men on the landing day. By the end, I think their casualty rate was like 56%. And in some of the battalions, one of the battalions, it was 71%. They were just totally chewed up, and so they were relieved by the Army. But Rupertus, again, assigned the Army, which is now in the island, to secondary roles. So they weren't fully involved in the main attacks on the Brogel. He brought in the 5th Marine Regiment, the 7th Marine Regiment first, and then the 5th Marine Regiment. He wanted to finish it with the Marines, but eventually the Army took over the whole operation and finished it.
It's the 5th Marines that seem to make traction with Colonel Harris has a new approach. And is that Colonel Harris bringing in the new approach, or is that coming from the top down to him?
No, they didn't listen to him. They should have. He was in charge of the 5th Regiment. He was younger than the other senior officers. They didn't listen to him. He went up soon after they opened the airstrip and brought in recon planes. He went up in one of those and flew over the Brogel and looked at it. He was just amazed how horrible the defenses were there. But he could see if you attacked from the north side, they had a much better chance of getting in there and neutralizing the defenses. But the Japanese had set up everything to oppose attacks from the south. And that's what Rupertus and Polar were doing, attacking from the south again and again. So Harris landed and went over and met with Polar and Rupertus. Said, you should go up and look at it, see what this is like. The north side, that's the way to come in. And they just kind of chuckled. And they said, we have our maps. We don't need to go up. So they just brushed them off. But actually, that's what the Army did. And eventually, Rupertus let Harris approach from that direction. He sort of came around. It's too bad he allowed one of his regiments to be destroyed first. Yeah, Harris had the right idea. And his idea was not only to attack from the north, but to use your supporting arms first. Artillery, mortars, airstrikes, all that stuff. And then send in the infantry, after they've softened them up a little bit.
Obviously, I made it up, bulldozers, tanks and flamethrowers. it's bringing all that kind of, as you say, technology to try and soften things up. I wonder if we we've been looking at the campaign from the American point of view. If we turn the tables to look at the Japanese, how are they faring? I mean, we talk about their defensive positions, well equipped, tunnels, blast doors on these tunnels, things. How are they faring in comparison to the Marines? Are they being as equally decimated?
Yeah, they were. They were equally decimated. The Japanese mentality at that point, throughout the war, was they were prepared to die, and they wanted to die as a warrior. That was a great thing to happen. And so that part didn't trouble them. They were... In Peleliu, they had plenty of food. They had water. They had ammunition. They were well stocked. But they knew that no one was going to come and save them. They had no air support. There was no Air Force. There was no Navy to help them. What they had on the island was all that they had. They did try to resupply them. There was a larger unit up at Babelthwap, farther up in the Palas, and they tried to send reinforcements to Peleliu. And initially they succeeded. They bring them in on barges at night. They got several hundred reinforcements in eventually. But then the Americans figured out what was going on after they'd sunk some of the barges, but some of the men had gotten ashore. So that's when they decided to secure the entire northern part of the island so no more could get in. And that shut off that little conduit into the island. But initially, the Japanese had probably about 11,000 soldiers on Peleliu. It's a 6-mile-long island. They were dug in very well. And they had another few thousand laborers from Korea, Okinawa. They had naval construction troops. All of them ended up fighting and dying,
We're going to take a short break. We'll be back with you in a moment. Welcome back. We're talking about the Battle of Peleliu with Joseph Wheelan. When the Marines are finally withdrawn and it becomes an army operation, and it's them that finally reduces and closes the pocket, destroys the pocket. Are they doing anything different? Are they facing anything different? Because are they physically having to go in and clear out these networks of caves?
Yeah, they did. They had to, satchel charges, grenades, rifles, machine guns, flamethrowers. That was the big thing. Some of those LVTs, they equipped them with flamethrowers. So they were using the LVTs on the island, on Peleliu, almost like tanks. And they would get in close with those flamethrowers and blast out the caves. Basically, the operation turned into a battle in which companies and platoons did the hard work. They went in and with satchel charges, flamethrowers, rifles, machine guns, and ferreted them out. By the time the Army took over, they had reduced the Japanese hold on the island to a pocket, maybe 500 yards wide, maybe a little longer. And they were being held in there, and they were being hit by airstrikes, rockets, and most effectively napalm.
It's not often you hear about napalm during the Second World War. I was quite surprised to read that it was used. I don't know why.
Yeah, it was used in the islands. They used napalm. They even a gasoline line to a gas truck on this road and bring a pipe all the way up and over the hill, and then they would use it to flood caves and then throw phosphorus grenades in there to ignite them. Terrible way to die.
So when the end comes, is it a final banzai charge and we know it's over, or is it just peter out?
It just petered out. Less and less opposition. Eventually, they found the command cave. It was in a hole in the cave underground, in a place called China Wall. And on November 25th or 26th, the commander, Colonel Nakagawa, and his co-commander committed suicide there. The Americans learned from a prisoner the next day that they were dead, and went in there and found the bodies, and that was it. That was the end of it. Although there were still people hiding up in those caves. Actually, the last of them, the group of about 26, came out in March 1947. They subsisted, for 2.5 years in there, stealing supplies. Americans knew they were there because someone was breaking into their warehouses. But eventually they went out and they sent patrols out. They brought a Marine unit back in to the island, and they sent patrols out every day, along with Japanese officers who had been captured and, announced the war was over in bullhorns. So they drove around in jeeps. They knew there were people out there, and they tried to bring them in. They finally found where they were all staying, convinced the lieutenant that was in charge to come out and surrender. They went back to Japan. They were big heroes, you know.
Once the island was taken, how important was it to U.S. operations in the Pacific?
Not important at all, really. They built a big hospital there. It was kind of a way station. As the war moved on to Iwo Jima and Okinawa and the Philippines, the planes could land there and be refueled. They'd bring wounded from those campaigns to Peleliu, to the hospitals, before they were transferred to Pearl Harbor, the States. In fact, kind of interesting, in 1945, you've heard of the USS Indianapolis?
Yeah, Jaws.
Yes, yeah, see, right. That ship went down, and nobody knew where it was. It was a cruiser, and they had delivered the bomb to Tinian. Was out there, and it was torpedoed, and that sank, and the sharks got the people that were still alive in the water. It was a terrible ordeal, but they were discovered finally by a patrol plane that took off from Peleliu, routine patrol, and he spotted them in the water, and it was kind of an amphibious plane. He was under orders to just report the location and then go back to base. But he disobeyed orders and landed and took aboard a bunch of those guys and tried to help beat off the sharks. You could see the sharks circling underneath, farther down from where the men were trying to stay afloat. Those poor devils, they brought them back to Peleliu, to that hospital, and then sent them on to the States. But that was probably the last service that island provided to the United States. So the war just moved on, you know.
Reflecting back on it, it says it has a higher casualty rate than, I think I'm right in saying, than Iwo Jima and Okinawa, which are probably undoubtedly better remembered. Yeah, it's the Japanese that seem to have. It's a tourist destination for the Japanese from the 60s, not for the Americans.
Well, it's closer, you know. It's a long ways from the States. There were some veterans of that battle, very few, that went out there to Peleliu to visit those places where they had fought. And there's a monument there to the Army and the 1st Marine Division. But the Japanese, band's a lot closer. And so they would bring flights of people and boatloads down, tourists. And they would mourn the dead, and they were taking bones, human bones, back to Japan, give them proper burials until the Peleliu government stopped that practice. Probably the important thing about Peleliu is that it was the first of these attritional strategic battles that Japan fought that killed so many Americans. And the second one was Iwo Jima. It was fought exactly the same way. They dug in underground, and then Okinawa was the third. This one battalion commander of the Marines, Colonel Ray Davis, said that it was tragic after Peleliu because of the lessons that were learned there. For some reason, never made it to the commanders that went into Iwo Jima. So they had to learn it all over again, how to fight under those conditions.
I never thought about this, but how quickly is Iwo Jima after Peleliu? Because the slightly, as I say, my chronology of the Pacific's dreadful, but it's really fast paced when it all starts to happen towards the end in 44, 45.
That's right. Yeah, true. Yeah, let's see, Peleliu was started in September, ended November 27th. Iwo Jima landing was in February. Okinawa, it was April 1st. So, yes, the pace just picked up.
I suppose they do have time for that information to filter through between the landing in September and another landing in February and, again, another landing in April.
Yeah, you would have thought, though, that it would have. It was all Marine Corps, the Iwo Jima and Peleliu. It should have, but they were different units, 1st Marine Division, and then there was the 3rd, 4th, and 5th on Iwo Jima. So I don't know.
Well, with the end of the war, and in fact, we're now beyond the end of the war, we should perhaps bring things to a close. Thanks for joining me. Loyal listener, Joseph's book is Bitter Peleliu, The Forgotten Struggle on the Pacific War's Worst Battlefield. I will put a link to the book on the website, www.podcast.com. Next time, I've got a great episode looking at a US Navy combat diver who landed on D-Day and was then shipped to the Pacific and took part in the landings at Iwo Jima, Okinawa and Borneo. It's an incredible story. Now, if you have enjoyed this episode of the show, why not consider becoming a patron? You can find out more at patreon.com/WW2podcast. For patrons, Patreon will give you a custom RSS feed to use with your podcast software, which you can use to get extra World War II chat and advert-free episodes magically appearing on your device. So that is patreon.com/WW2podcast. Well, that is all for me for now. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.
Jerry 88mm gun hit our town. Blew us the hell out of it.
Stalingrad can never be repaired.
As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice.